Arranca una nueva edición de los Podcast AoB de Spainsif, el Foro Español de Inversión Sostenible y Responsable. Un espacio donde pretendemos recoger algunas de las conversaciones más interesantes sobre finanzas sostenibles entre los miembros de Spainsif y sus grupos de interés. En esta ocasión tenemos con nosotros a dos profesionales de AWS, a Michael Lewis, Head of ESG Research, y a Jens Witzke, Head of Product Specialist for Private Debt. Ellos nos van a hablar de un tema de muchísimo calado, European Transformation with respect to sustainable finance. Michael, Jens, cuando estéis listos, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much. Well, Jens, I work in London, you work in Frankfurt, and we're in this lovely office in Spain. And thank you, Spainsif, for letting us do all of this. We're so excited about this European transformation project. For me, it's great because I think we really are probably in the most dramatic change in the next 10 years. And I think this is what we're trying to capture and understand. And I wanted to ask you, actually, how do you see this transformation and this initiative that really, I guess, we only launched at the end of last year?
Well, Michael, glad first of all that we finally made it to sit in person together after this long time. And yes, indeed, European transformation is for us a very important topic. So to provide some background, last year when we started our strategic planning for 2023 and beyond, we discussed the important trends in the market, what has changed in the macro environment, and we realized that this theme of European transformation is to some extent omnipresent. So what do we mean when we talk about European transformation? We think about the prosperity of Europe, the European economy, and people living here, the health, the wealth we have, and we aim to understand what is changing. What are the important drivers, and what do we need to secure this kind of prosperity? And definitely we do see some incidences, some events, so to say. If you think about the pandemic, if you unfortunately see the war between Ukraine and Russia, that there is the need for change to secure this prosperity, and that there is a certain sense of urgency. So while we, of course, already have a lot of investment solutions on our platform, which we think are very much aligned to this thesis of European transformation, we also understood that much more needs to be done, that this is a much bigger topic than just thinking about selective investment solutions. And we thought, how can we tackle this challenge? So we kicked off a growth initiative, which is really feeding into our entire organization across investments, product developments, public affairs, to coordinate ourselves and see how we can tackle the challenges we might see around the European transformation and how can we derive solutions. And I think the first thing we agreed on was to spend some time on what is European transformation about? What are these challenges? And that we need to frame it to some extent. It could not be too broad. It can be very much, but we have to give some guidance also to people. How do we think about this theme? So I think a very first important step we then did was to develop a kind of framework for the European transformation, which I personally think is very relevant and important to share with the people listening here, what we did in there. And that might be something you can provide a bit more details on.
Yes, I think the question for us was, why do we need to transform? Where do we need to transform? And how are we going to do it? And I think when we looked at why, I think what's so interesting is that so many forces have come together all at the same time. And I think really geopolitics has mobilized this, as you were just mentioning, that there is enormous urgency now. And I think it sort of came out really, I think we suddenly saw it when COVID broke out. We suddenly saw the inability to get medical equipment from Asia. We suddenly realized that we had these dependencies, incredibly long supply chains. And when they get broken, they have enormous impacts on the economy. And then we had naturally the Putin's war in Ukraine. We suddenly realized that the dependency on fossil fuels, particularly natural gas, which you look at Germany, and I would say the mistakes, and these were signposted quite, we sort of knew, but we tried to hope. I think we had a hope that capital markets and money going into autocratic regimes would change not just the market reforms of these economies, but also the political nature of how these countries operate. And I think Putin's war shattered that sort of hope and naivety. So we had this geopolitical sort of machine that said, we really do need to transform radically. But behind that, we've also got this incredible decarbonisation program. And actually, if you look at Europe, Europe has been a genius, actually. I mean, it's not going fast enough, but it's a genius region. It's leading the world in decarbonising. And we've got incredibly ambitious areas. I'm going to come on to where we need to transform, but there are still more. There's competitiveness of Europe. You know, if as an investor over the last 10 years, Europe really has not been a very exciting place. There are pockets, and we want to just really try and work with governments and policymakers to really bring out the growth of this economy. In the last 10 years, I think the US equities have outperformed European equities by about 200%. Europe has been a little bit of a passenger in this kind of IT revolution. We haven't really got the growth stocks like the Teslas, the Amazon, all the Googles and the Microsofts. And how do we change that? And then we've also got capital deployment. So much of this financing of this transformation, which, Jens, you're the expert on this bit, is really is going to have to be driven by the private sector. So that was another role we really wanted as an asset manager to say, how can we be very engaged and forceful in that deployment? And then that's the old story of demographics. You know, we're a continent that's slightly stagnating. That means, you know, as I'm an economist, you know, that typically is lower productivity, it's lower economic growth, it's typically lower investment returns. How do we turn this around? And then there's obviously the huge amounts of legislation. So multiple reasons as to why we need to change. I think what was interesting is, where do we need to change? And I think here was quite interesting. We started to look at, you know, the really three key sectors, obviously energy and energy systems. And then we looked at buildings. I think people forget actually that we live 90% of our time in buildings, where we live and where we work. And these are massive sort of emitters. And then transportation. And what we wanted to say was, actually in certain areas, Europe is leading, and we must make sure that Europe is not complacent. And I think transportation is a really critical one, because transportation, if you asked anybody on the street, Europe's great at decarbonising, but tell me which sector is not decarbonised. And actually emissions are actually higher over the last 30 years compared to everyone else that's actually decarbonised, and it's transport. And Europe's been pretty good at becoming a global hub of electric vehicle production. I think a third of the world's electric vehicle car fleet is in Europe, and about a fifth of their charging point infrastructure is here. But now we've got a bit of a dilemma. We really need to be putting more capital into infrastructure, green infrastructure. We also, as I say, buildings. This is another area we really need to be looking at energy efficiency, looking at retrofitting buildings. And I think there's some pretty exciting sort of products and investments that we can bring to the table there. And then energy systems. The one thing that we may forget is offshore wind. I mean, we had this brilliant sort of conference, and we were just talking about how Spain is an absolute global leader. It's always quite nice when somebody tells your country you are a global leader in solar, and you are real world experts in how difficult it is and how well it is and how you can be very successful in deployment. So I think Spain could be a little bit of a test case for other countries around the world. And so I think the next one we're looking at is offshore wind. And actually, if you look at offshore wind, we globally, only about 7% of total wind capacity is offshore. So it's the real kind of poor cousin of onshore, primarily because offshore is just a little bit difficult. But offshore wind is a lot more reliable over the sea than it is over the land. And actually what we're seeing over the last few years is more and more deployment of offshore wind. So I think this is going to be a really exciting area. This is where things are going to change. And I think you might be looking a little bit further north if you're sitting in Madrid or Bilbao, because quite a lot of that is going to be North Sea. That's going to be going to be an interesting reading. But I guess, Jens, the question is, we know the why, we know the where. How on earth are we going to get there?
Well, we need a lot of capital. And the one point you just mentioned, yes, there is talent, and it's also about keeping that talent where it is and not letting that talent go. So that's clearly also an ambition we would have, to create an attractive environment for talent to stay here and help us to work on this project. When it comes to how can we finance all this, I think we have to look at three different parties. So obviously, we as an asset manager are keen to create investment solutions and to raise capital for these kind of investment solutions. However, we have to acknowledge that our investors, especially if they are regulated, have constraints, have a certain target function they are following. And while we might say there is a very good investment opportunity, that risk return profile might not match this kind of target function of our investors. Maybe because of certain risks they would have to take, whether that is the credit risk, whether that is the kind of maturity, whether that is uncertainty with regulation. All these might be constraints then for investors to step in. A second party we have to look at are, of course, banks. So naturally, banks are providing a lot of financing, are lending, but we can see that banks are constrained by regulation, how much they can lend, at which terms they can lend, the risk they are allowed to take. And we certainly see that is rather increasing. So the question would be, who can provide the capital which is missing here? If we just think about direct lending, the alternative lenders market, there is a clear trend that banks have to stop at certain leverage points, especially to lend money, and that alternative lenders, direct lenders, have to step in to fill this kind of gap. So banks will definitely play an important role. However, there might be still a gap where also governmental entities, public money has to support the kind of solutions we need. So if you think about blended finance structures, public-private partnerships, we might need solutions where a public institution provides a first loss piece to make the risk-return profile attractive, or simply to kick off certain investments like we have seen on the energy efficiency side. To attract additional investments then, which needs to be done. And I think case by case, we will carefully have to analyze who can provide which part of capital. Do we have to do something jointly in one product? Is it a split product? All this has to be analyzed case by case, and then we can create investment solutions. I mean, the framework we have established last year speaks about a potentially investment gap of 600 billion per annum. This is a large number, and of course depends a lot on the sources you are looking at and how this is derived. Whether this is 550 or 650 billion, it's massive. There is a massive demand for capital which has to be mobilized. We rather think that would be private markets capital which needs to be mobilized. It might be very tailor-made. It is very long-term. Also companies, maybe, if again I would look at the direct lending market, which don't have the access to public markets but need certain financing. And of course, if all this is structured well, then it should also create very good investment opportunities for our investors. Second, if we think about the asset classes, this is a very wide spectrum. It goes, as you said, from infrastructure investments to real estate, but also to this mid-market, where we would say that 50% of the European GDP is created by mid-market companies. So a lot of investments need to be happen in that space. Infrastructure investments, you mentioned wind, for example, EV charging, massive investments have to take place. So across asset classes, there will be a wide spectrum of financing needs. The question, I think, which is important here, while we look at all these type of investments from a fundamental perspective, understanding the business case, the credit case, the long-term growth perspectives, that is what we usually do as investors. The question is, how can that theme of European transformation support the investment cases in addition? And what we feel is attractive is that there is this strong political will, and also a lot of the topics we talk about is can say supported, but it's simply pushed also by regulation. If we talk about all the sustainable investments, ESG, everything which needs to happen, and where we would say Europe is leading in those areas. If we compare ourselves against the US, against APAC, now looking at Europe, we see data that Europe is leading, and I think that's a very positive message where we can, which we can even push further. So that might be a good topic to give some transparency. What is Europe currently doing in terms of political initiatives and regulation, which supports these kind of investment cases?
Yes, I think what's so interesting is a bit like all the forces that are driving this European transformation that we mentioned earlier. There's so much forces that are also trying to direct capital to the right place. So we are helped by an environment from politicians and legislators to actually move that money to the right area. We now have taxonomy, so we know, in a sense, what's good and bad. We know how to move that capital where it should be going to. So I think this environment also, to me, is sort of pushing at an open door. It's allowing this capital, because we've got things like the Capital Markets Union, the Green Deal, the taxonomies, these SCFDRs. We are trying to channel certain investments through that political ambition. And so that, to me, is another factor which is sort of helping us move money sort of in the right direction. I think your point about the small and medium-sized enterprises, I think this community, to me, I think they get a little bit forgotten. We look at the big companies that are doing all the sort of greening, but actually, as you said, they're 50% of the economy. They're about 60% of greenhouse gas emissions, that community. I think 2 out of 3 jobs small and medium-sized enterprises are employing. And I think I read somewhere that actually of new jobs created, they're about 85%. So I think, yeah, it's extraordinary numbers. So we've kind of done the why, the where, the how, and the who now. For me, I think the political environment is also one. I think there are certain areas where we need to, as asset managers, speak out where we think things may be needing to be tweaked a little bit. And we need to be aware that, some things like SFDR, the Article 8, Article 9, the light green, the dark green, we hear about this a lot. And so this labelling incredibly important so that people can understand whether we've got funds that don't really do anything or they do a little bit, and then maybe there's a bit of impact. One of the things I'm a bit worried about is everything needs to transform. And if all the money's going to the sort of the dark greens, and this is what about the Article 6? Because actually, those are the people that we really need to transform, and they're sort of slightly left out of the loop. So we mustn't ever forget that actually there is a huge segment of the economy that does need to be transformed. And I think that's, I think, the bit that I'm really interested in is that transformation of theirs. Because I think a lot of the investments that we've talked about is sort of private markets. It's sort of somewhere not really the mainstream. It's not the kind of the listed equity in the public markets. And so I think there is, we do need to look at that sort of space as well. So I'm quite optimistic that we've got so many different channels here that are working. And I'd sort of end it that, for me, as a research person for a very long time, for me, it was never argue with flow, because flow is really where the money's flowing. And so I think maybe people don't realize that when we look at clean energy investment, this, in euro terms, this overtook fossil fuel investment about 6 years ago. So this trend, and actually with COVID, it's accelerated. So I think we're in the midst of this transformation sort of almost happened. It's happening already. And I think what we're trying to do is trying to accelerate it. But I guess, Jens, can we do this all on our own? Who are the big stakeholders that kind of need to be there with us?
So I don't expect you to answer me that question with yes. So no, probably not. You're right. Can we do it on our own? Probably not. Is it short term? Probably not. The environment is always changing and transforming, and you're right. We are seeing a sense of urgency here, and why we have to move fast and in a consequent way. This is long term. It might be 1-2 decades that all this takes time for, and in terms of also who can solve this, we can only solve this all together. And that's also something we realized and discussed when we then kicked off this initiative, that we said, look, we have to broaden the people we talk to and engage with. So it's not just our community of maybe the asset management, but we also have to talk to the banks, understand their limitations. We have to engage much more with politicians and regulators, to understand what they are looking into, what they aim to support, but also to provide maybe our insights on what could resonate well with a client. So to bridge this kind of understanding, and then jointly create hopefully solutions which are complementary and which also then can be allocated in client portfolios. So there is a lot of engagement with politicians, regulators, in, I would say, a very institutional way. And second, also from a research perspective, and appreciate that I would say in DWS we have a great research team and knowledge, but we cannot do everything. So of course, we said we have to invite external academics, external parties as well, to encourage and say, let's join this initiative and work on thought leadership and research to understand the challenges and to create solutions. If, for example, you think about financial markets and bank regulation, do we need to change something? And that is why we initiated a partnership, or we are sponsoring a Center for European Transformation at the Frankfurt School, have just initiated that with the idea to, A, of course, facilitate research, and B, to have a kind of hub where experts can come together from financial industry, from regulation, from political entities, but also from the real economy, from industrial sectors, for example, to share their thoughts, thinking, challenges, and by this derive solutions. And of course, that is also not just a European thing, but also we have the first person joining from the US, because while this is the European transformation, we are still acting in a global economy. So everything is linked to each other. And that kind of journey has just started, truly with the invitation to other parties to join this initiative, and then long-term make it hopefully a success.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's always a pleasure chatting to you. And now we can enjoy the beautiful city of Madrid.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Michael, Jens. Nos vemos en siguientes conversaciones multi-stakeholder. Hasta la próxima.